Remove the cotter pin. You want to save this for reinstallation, and then using adjustable joint pliers, remove the slotted nut, which will allow you to pull the hub from the car. Again, you want to save all of this for reinstallation. Remove the cotter pin that's holding your tie rod end to the spindle, and then you want to unbolt the tie rod end from the spindle. Using an 11/16 socket, remove the castle nut from the tie rod. Now we got to remove the tie rod from the spindle. We're using a ball joint splitter. If you don't have one of these to lift it up, you can just tap on the side, which will allow you to bring it up also. Again, you want to save the cotter pins and the nuts for reinstallation. Using a 5/8 socket, remove the nut that's holding the drag link or your main tie rod from the spindle. And then remove the tie rod end. Using a 3/4 inch wrench and socket, remove the kingpin bolt from the spindle. Now you remove the kingpin bolt. You're able to pull the spindle off the car. You want to save the kingpin bolt, you want to save the thrust washer, and you want to save the kingpin tube from the spindle. Lube these up before you install them into the new Jake spindle. After you clean and grease the kingpin tube, insert it into Jake's new spindle. Put your stock thrust washer on top. Install the spindle to the axle using the stock kingpin tube and nut. Install the spindle to the new axle. Using 3/4 inch wrench and socket, install the spindle to the axle securely. Now we want to install the tie rods to the car. The main drag link from wheel to wheel goes up through, just like stock. And then your tie rod from the steering box goes down through the spindle as shown. Use the stock nuts and make sure you put your cotter pins back in. Using a 5/8 socket and an 11/16 wrench, securely install the main tie rod from wheel to wheel to the spindle. Using an 11/16 socket, install the tie rod from the steering box to the spindle. Securely do this, and remember to reinstall your cotter pin. The final step is reinstalling your hub. As you can see, these spindles are brake capable. They have the 6 pre-drilled holes in the spindle. And you reinstall the hub the same way you took it off, and don't forget to put your cotter pin in. Now that you have the hub back on, double check that you reinstalled all your cotter pins and all the bolts are securely tightened. Perform the same steps to the driver's side of the car. Jack the rear end up high enough and pull the driver's side brake cable out of the stock mount. It's not going to go back in the mount. Once the rear lift is done, you want to take and wire tie this to the frame. Now that you got the U-bolts off the ISO mount on both the driver and passenger side, you want to remove the ISO mount from the axle along with the rubber bushing. And the stock shock mount. Using a 9/16 ratchet and wrench, remove the leaf spring from the rear leaf spring mount. Save these bolts for reinstallation. do both the driver and passenger side. Using a 9/16 and an 11/16, remove the bolt that's holding the front of the leaf spring to the car on both the driver and passenger side. You want to save these bolts for reinstallation. Now that you have the rear leaf springs removed, use the car jack to drop the rear. Now you're going to reinstall the leaf springs to the stock front mount using the stock hardware, and you're going to install it to the rear mount using the stock hardware. Do not tighten it this time until you get the whole rear lift into place. This lift kit will work with both standard leaf springs and heavy-duty leaf springs. Now you take the new rear risers, sit on top of the axle, use the center pin on the axle as a guide, and the center hole is actually going to go up into the bolt of the leaf spring. Do this to both driver and passenger side. Take the new supplied U-bolts and bring up through the bottom of the riser and around the axle to both the driver and passenger side as shown. Using the car jack, bring the rear end up to center your center pin on the leaf spring with your riser, and then using the stock shock mount, install to the top of the leaf spring with the center pin in the center, and you're going to tighten with the supplied nuts, and then reinstall your shock to the new shock mount using the stock nut. Now that you have everything in place, you want to securely tighten the rear lift. And make sure you use a torque sequence and you show about the same amount of threads in each bolt. And then securely tighten your shock to the shock mount. To both driver and passenger side, and then the last step is to securely install your leaf springs. Install your wheels and tires, double check all your nuts and bolts securely tightened, and you're done. Now we're going to show you how to adjust the toe. What you want to do is take a tape measure and pick out a tread in the front portion of the front tires, measure from the driver's side to the passenger side to that same tread, and get your measurement. Now you want to pick out the same tread in the rear portion of the front tires and measure across from driver's side to passenger side and get your measurement. When the toe is properly set, you should be 1/8 to 1/4 inch narrower in the front than it is the rear. Right now we are actually toed out. We are narrower in the rear than we are the front. So we're going to show you how to make the adjustment to toe it in properly. Using a 7/8 inch wrench, you need to loosen the jam nuts on both the driver and passenger side of your main tie rod that runs from wheel to wheel. Make sure you turn it around about 4 turns on each side to give you enough room to make adjustments. There's a flat spot in the middle of the tie rod, and using a 9/16 wrench, you want to turn the tie rod. We're actually going to lengthen the tie rod because we're going to bring the front in by pushing the rear portion out. Turn it a turn or two and remeasure, and once you have the proper alignment set where your front portion of the tires are a 1/4 inch narrower than the rear portion of the front tires, use your 7/8 inch wrench and retighten your jam nuts.